Welcome, everybody. My name is Eric Liu, and I am the director of the Aspen Institute's new program on citizenship and American identity. I'm so pleased to have this session here in conversation with my friend Anne-Marie Slaughter, who is CEO of the New America Foundation, and somebody who, for many years in many ways, but particularly on the topic that we have this afternoon, has been shaping me long before we actually even met in person to talk about these topics. She was shaping me in her writing and thinking. So what I thought we would do here, just to give a little bit of the roadmap for our little less than an hour together, is describe a little bit the topic itself and the genesis of this topic that we're going to all be discussing here today. Anne-Marie and I will then have a little bit of a conversation about that topic. And then we really want to open it up for questions if you have questions, but as much just for your ideas and your input. I believe we've passed around copies of an article that's just published in Democracy Journal that I wrote that is partly the catalyst for this conversation and for our theme. So come on in, folks. The topic, and this is like as the airplane is about to close its gates, if you are not here for How to Be American, feel free to get up and leave now. But if you are here, it is so exciting to have this conversation in such a full house and with so much energy here. This topic is one that is perennial, timeless, I think, for us here in the United States. But it's particularly timely right now. And what I thought I would do is describe a little bit in thumbnail what the argument is in this article, this essay that we've passed out, as a way to tee up the conversation Anne-Marie and I will have, and then also to kind of tee up an invitation that we're going to extend to you to offer up some ideas and input. So, how many of you have heard of E.D. Hirsch? Okay, a few, but not all that many. So in 1987, E.D. Hirsch, then a professor of English at the University of Virginia, published a book called Cultural Literacy. And it was a very erudite book, 80% of which was just really with the education theorist's eye, talking about the necessity when you're reading and learning to read, the necessity for common knowledge, right? Common knowledge, not just, of course, actual literacy in English, but common knowledge, knowing references, understanding when people talk about a house divided, what they're referring to. When people talk about the shot heard round the world, what's being referred to. When they talk about various things that are part of our history, our culture, and our shared civic identity. And he wrote this book, 80% of which was this very kind of academic treatise, and the appendix of which was a list that he and two colleagues compiled of 5,000 things every American should know. In a fashion that must be a dream for any academic author, that appendix carried that book to the top of the bestseller list. It became this incredible phenomenon because that book came out just at the moment, we may remember, late 80s, early 90s, when a lot of these questions about multiculturalism, about political correctness, about the way we talk about who we are, was in this incredible period of flux. And this list that he produced of 5,000 things every American should know ended up on the cover of magazines. He ended up on the Today Show talking about this stuff. And he arrived at this moment of cultural anxiety in the United States. This sense that things were changing here and that the things that people should know, and indeed the people who decide the things that people should know, were beginning to be in flux, right? And that was exciting to some and very disorienting and disconcerting to many others. And E.D. Hirsch, who is this very, again, as I say, erudite, you've actually been family friends for a long time, not a polemicist, not particularly an ideological person, walked smack right into the middle of the culture war, basically. And there was a great debate about this list of 5,000. And the thing that was remarkable about this in 1987 was that because so much of the list had to do with not only our past, but particularly the past deeds, words, and ideas of dead white men, and because it arrived at this moment, E.D. Hirsch the person and his work got completely obliterated. And E.D. Hirsch became this caricature in the media, and this caricature in which he stood for a conservative counterattack against diversity, against multiculturalism, against all this stuff where people are just saying, hey, anything goes in America and we can just forget about the founding fathers and early civics and stuff. He came to stand for a position that said, no, we got to remember what the dead white men did, right? And then people, again, without ever having read his book or the list, started attacking him from the left for just the same reasons. Who is this guy who says that we need to know 5,000 things, most of which belong to dead white men? We hate this guy, right? And there ended up being this quite interesting cultural debate in the United States about not only the list, but about the idea itself of cultural literacy, of having common language, common knowledge, common vocabulary, right? Well, this essay that I've written here for a Democracy Journal makes an argument that basically E.D. Hirsch was at least half right. And the ways in which he was half right are actually more urgent than ever. The ways in which he was half right are that it has always been the case, but it is particularly the case today in a time where we have nearly unprecedented inequality, at a time when we have incredible demographic flux, at a time when the babies being born now in the United States are now majority babies of color, where within a few years kindergartners will be majority children of color. Where our demography is shifting in this tectonic way. And this fundamental question, which some of you who were here at the Ideas Festival last year, we explored a little bit in this way, who is us? Makes E.D. Hirsch's project, the idea of saying, hey, there's got to be some common basis, some common basket of knowledge and references and ideas and images and symbols and stories that allow us, an ever more diverse society, to hold together. So in that sense, he was right. The way, though, in which he wasn't quite right or quite up to his times was the way in which that list was so focused on dead white men and so focused on our Anglo heritage as a nation, right? And so the argument that I make in this essay is essentially what we've got to do, what we get to do right now, is to reimagine not only the list, but to reimagine the idea of cultural literacy itself for an America that is truly diverse, for an America that in its public institutions is beginning to become as diverse as its people are and as inclusive as it's always told people it was, right? And so we're in this moment right now where the closing of that gap between our stated ideals and the actual practice of the embrace of diversity both forces us and invites us to think about what should every American know now, right? What is it? Except it's not just now a matter of adding to that list the stories of Chinese Americans or the experiences of Muslim Americans or the deeds and struggles of women throughout American history. It's not enough only to do that. It's also important now that we dispense with the idea that one, or actually in E.D. Hirsch's case, 3 really smart dudes hole up in a room and come up with a list of 5,000 things, right? That what this moment actually calls upon us to do, us here in this room and us as a society, is actually together in a way that you can think of as crowdsourced, but just think of as truly participatory, that we decide together what shall be the content of a new American culture. What are the things that, if you feel like you're a newcomer to the mainstream, and I don't mean only an immigrant brand new to the shores of the United States, but you could be a newcomer somebody who grew up in a poor rural area moving to the big city. You could be a newcomer who's a first-generation college student finally coming to college campus. You could be a newcomer of class, of race, of religion, of region. If you are a newcomer and want to claim voice and claim something else, which I think is key in this conversation, power. If you want to claim power as a citizen in the United States, what is the common language and common vocabulary that you need to be able to speak and understand and be literate in? What are the references? What are the symbols? What are the words? At the end of this essay, both in the print version, but particularly online, Democracy, we actually invite readers not to come up with a list of 5,000, but to come up with at least your top 10. What would be 10 things you would want to make sure every American knows? And so as I begin to open this conversation up with Anne-Marie, I want to just plant that seed in your minds. Start thinking a little bit about what are 10 things you'd like to make sure every American knows about. And maybe they're the things that every American has always been told they should know about, but maybe there are a bunch of other more interesting and diverse things. And after Anne-Marie and I have a bit of conversation here, we want to open it up for not only for your list, but for your larger reflections on this moment in national cultural cohesion. So, Anne-Marie is, as you know, CEO of New America Foundation, a writer of great note on a whole variety of things. Many of you recently saw essays that she's written for The Atlantic about women and men and family and work and balance and the rest. And that work has been pioneering and very game-changing in a lot of ways. She also served in the State Department in the Obama administration in policy planning. And before that, had a long career at Princeton. And wrote a book a bunch of years ago now. I'm not sure how many years ago.
2007.
2007, called The Idea That Is America. Yeah. And Anne-Marie, I guess, given how much you've spent thinking about this topic, I'd like to hear your take on this notion of cultural literacy and where you feel like we as a people need to go in order to shift the conversation about that common cultural core.
Thank you. So I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I did know E.D. Hirsch and went to school with his son. And I just have to say, I now have a great deal of sympathy with an academic who wrote something that became emblematic in wars where many of the people engaging in the debates had never actually read the work. I really, I identify deeply. But this question, and the first thing to say is to thank Eric and to tell all of you to read this article. It's a wonderful article. I'm going to give you one sentence, which I tweeted when I read it. Eric writes, "Americanness and whiteness are fitfully, achingly, but finally becoming delinked. And like it or not, over the course of this generation, we're all going to have to imagine a new way to be American." And that is such a wonderful challenge to us as a nation. And when I wrote The Idea That Is America, I started in 2004 after Abu Ghraib, because my sense of what it meant to be an American was standing for things in the world that we didn't do things other nations did. I remember Vietnam. It wasn't that I thought we were perfect by any means, but the idea that when I traveled, I saw a picture of someone on a box with a hood over them with a wire in a horrible caricature of the Statue of Liberty, and that's what it meant to be American for other people in the world, I couldn't stand it. I wrote that book as not an academic book. It was a cry from the heart. And my argument was what it means to be American is to have these ideals that we always fall short of. We fell profoundly short of them at the founding. We talked about all men are created equal, and then some men who had black skin were 3/5 men in our Constitution. So we were flawed from the beginning, but what it means to be an American is to be constantly renewing ourselves in striving to get ever closer to those ideals. And from that perspective, the idea that now we are reinventing ourselves as a people that reflect the world is to me enormously exciting. It's why I run something called New America. I think that we are at a moment of great national renewal. But to do it, the people who do it just can't look like this room, right? I mean, this room is not New America. And neither are the corridors of power New America. My New America sitting in Washington looks like old America. So I will answer you by saying it is this moment where we are being invited to reflect the world and to identify who we are as a distinctive nation in the world, but the we who do that has got to look very different than the we who normally talk in places like this.
This notion of the we is, heck, just think about the last 10 days.
Yeah.
Just think about the last 10 days, in the good, the bad, and the ugly of what has gone on in this country, right? And the very kind of heightened, intense, sometimes literal and often figurative litigation that we are all involved in, kind of litigating the meaning of American identity, right? And how, both the thing that connects both the Supreme Court's decision on marriage equality and the rapid retreat that former champions of the Confederate flag have been beating recently is a reminder of how rapidly social norms, when they change, can finally change. You know, the nature of that change calls to mind a line that Ernest Hemingway once used about how he went bankrupt, which was gradually, then suddenly. So, you know, on both marriage and on, you know, how we deal with the part of our heritage nationally that is about the Confederacy and slavery, there has been a gradual, fitful, sometimes quite, you know, slow reckoning, and then you have punctuated moments, sometimes brought about by tragedy, as in Charleston, and sometimes brought about by you know, the machinery of our self-government, like with the marriage decision.
But I think that the Charleston debate actually, it highlights exactly that you can have a punctuated equilibrium and suddenly things can change quickly. But it also, there's a cautionary tale there. So I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia. Part of my family comes from North Carolina. A great-great-uncle was a general in the Civil War, which, yes, when I grew up was called the War Between the States. And yes, you know, my father and I talked over the weekend about the Confederate flag and what it had meant to him growing up, and that it was not seen, that it had been appropriated in his view in various ways. We have to find ways to talk about this without demonizing the entire South, right? And you know, so we really do. It's, for one thing, the South has lived a lot of issues, particularly race issues, far more intimately than the North has, and there has engaged in change that is harder to engage in when you're sort of pontificating from afar. But the other point I would make is, so now we're looking at, all right, let's get rid of all Confederate symbols. Okay, well, then let's get rid of Washington and Jefferson, okay? Because they're slaveholders, right? So let's just wipe out the Southern founding fathers. That can't be, right? There has to be some way that we can find a way to talk about this without then saying, okay, you're the enemy, we wipe you out, and then we go forward. And as proud as I've been of the country over the past week, I've also thought, ooh, I don't like where this is going, because you can't deny your history.
You know, one of the things that is a phrase that should be on the list, I think, of things every American should know, but actually comes from the experience in South Africa post-apartheid: truth and reconciliation.
Yep.
Right? So the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that that country undertook took seriously both parts of that phrase. I mean, there was truth-telling about the evils that were undertaken under that system, but also forms of reconciliation, right, and reckoning with one another. And I think one of the things about American life that, you know, to your point, it is impossible, even if you struck all Confederate symbols or struck down Confederate statues and so forth. This is the DNA of the United States.
Yeah, and you have to.
Just as, you know, there is no more American experience than the African American experience. You cannot strip any such strand of DNA out of the American character, right? You can perhaps have more grown-up conversations about the meaning and the power and the force of symbols. But I think the thing that is so important right now for us as Americans is we're not used to truth and reconciliation.
Yeah.
Right? We're used to telling a happy story about ourselves, and really wanting to believe it, and wanting to believe that there are things that are aberrations and exceptions to the happy story, right? I actually think in the broadest sense, I actually even agree with that. There is if you take the longest view of American history, it is a happy story of a country, as Anne-Marie says, trying ever harder to live in full alignment with its stated ideals, right? That's a happy story, but let's not kid ourselves about the gap, right? And I think this is part of what it means when we talk about cultural literacy, right? So the arguments that if you just take this debate about the Confederacy and the symbols of the Confederacy, it requires that we be literate in the Confederacy. It requires that we understand the vantage not only of a state like Virginia, which was not only had a central role in the Confederacy, but let's put it more simply, was a founding core entity of the creation of the United States, right? Before there was a United States as a singular, when people spoke of the United States as plural, they thought about Virginia as one of the most important kind of countries in the continent, right? And so there is a Virginia pride that one has to be literate in to understand the way that Anne Marie and Anne Marie's family is hearing these kinds of debates and conversations. As a son of immigrants,
American half, the Belgian half has a very different view.
and my Chinese whole, my second generation Chinese whole, having grown up in Poughkeepsie, New York, I grew up, not with that point of view, right? And I think part of the literacy, I happen to be married to a woman from Louisiana, so I have come to be, again, literate in the ways in which you can't just put people in a stereotypical box, right? But the language and the symbols. There is a book that I've just started reading by a Yale history professor named David Blight. The book is called American Oracle. And it's a wonderful piece of history and literary history where he is looking in the 1960s, the centennial of the Civil War, right? And he's looking at how 4 authors of that time, Robert Penn Warren, James Baldwin, Bruce Catton, and Edmund Wilson, were reckoning with the past. We're reckoning with the Civil War as the civil rights movement was unfolding live in real time in the United States, right? And he's talking about, the chapter on Robert Penn Warren in particular is sort of an encapsulation of what we're talking about here. If you want to be literate in America, the good, the bad, the ugly, the fact that you can't simply say it's one or the other, just read everything Robert Penn Warren ever wrote, right? Just kind of, he grew up steeped in family lore and legend about those who fought in the war between the states. He spent most of his professional career teaching in northern universities, either at Yale or Minnesota. And so he struggled all the time to how do you synthesize these dimensions, which aren't, again, just North and South. They are dimensions they are part of the kind of ongoing American arguments that we're always having. Central power versus state power, right? And the idea of liberty in tension with equality, right? And so things like that, I'm wondering for you, Anne Marie, like when you think about how you'd want to update a list of cultural literacy, and we were just talking about how not only have you been thinking about it, you've been inviting your family to think about it.
I plan to.
Okay. But what are the sorts of things that are on your list, and what are the sorts of things that maybe you think we should let go of?
So I'll give you my list, and let me say 2 things are as examples of how I think we can do this and how we are doing this. One example you write about, which is Hamilton. The musical Hamilton, which is really reinventing what a musical is. And as my husband pointed out, the lyrics, and it's essentially, it is, if you read Ron Chernow's biography of Hamilton, it is the biography of Hamilton set to rap. And the lyrics are so good that at one point when they move from the lyrics to Washington's farewell address, there's no variation in the quality of the prose. That's saying a lot. So, but it's this incredible, the cast is completely of color, right? They're representing founders who were, obviously Jefferson plays a big role, Washington plays a role, who were slaveholders, also those who are not. Hamilton himself is the ultimate outsider, and that's a big part of the story. But the ability to take culture. So one of the things on my list of 10 is jazz. One of the things on my list of 10 is jazz, because jazz, and my son's a jazz pianist, and the more I've learned about jazz and how it is a distinctively American art form of mashup, jazz is the mashup of its time, right? And if you don't understand jazz, there's a lot you don't understand about African American culture, but there's a lot you don't understand about American culture. So I would give you Hamilton. The other example I'll give you is something I just wrote about on Medium. I was just at my Princeton reunion of a certain, we don't need to go into the year, do we really? And if any of you who may know, Princeton reunions are a strange anthropological rite, but involving 8,000 people marching around in black and orange for 3 days. But this time, to your point about the Civil War, there were placards placed around the most historic buildings that said where you were standing 100 years ago and 150 years ago, right? Because it's 150 years, the end of the Civil War. And what those placards did was to tell part of the story of Princeton that we proud alums don't know. Like the first 8 presidents of Princeton in the North were slaveholders, right? That when you walk into Nassau Hall, you see a list of the dead, of the memorial dead. There are fewer Confederate dead than were actually Confederate dead because it was done in 1921 and Princeton didn't want to acknowledge just how Southern it was. So I offer that as a way of a great institution, and it is a great institution, can claim its own history and recognize it and not deny it and not apologize for it and not just have that be part of the conversation while people are back to celebrate, but also then to recognize, whoa, this is not a positive narrative. So with that, I'll give you the rest of my list. So I came up with 5 documents and 5 artifacts. Jazz is one of the artifacts. The 5 documents, here's a big surprise. The Declaration of Independence. There we go. The Gettysburg Address. The Declaration of Sentiments that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony wrote at Seneca Falls, which starts with, part of Eric's point is cultural literacy is the currency of power. And if you are not familiar with our common history, you can't deploy it to make change. So the women wrote, it's exactly the language of the Declaration of Independence, but it says all men and women are created equal. And then it says the history of mankind is a history. Oh, I can't do this. I thought I could. Sorry. All right. The history of mankind is a history of the injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward women, right? That is part of our history. So Declaration of Sentiments against women, the Korematsu dissent, right? The dissent, Justice Roberts and Korematsu about, the Supreme Court says it's fine to intern the Japanese, and one of the, Justice Jackson writes this great dissent, and I Have a Dream. Those 5, right, the I Have a Dream speech, from the Declaration of Independence to the Gettysburg Address, to the reinterpretation for women, to the statement about what we did to Asian Americans, and then to Martin Luther King. Those would be my 5 documents. And then I'd have Jazz, The Gilded Age, The Trail of Tears, Sojourner Truth, and The Dust Bowl. Those are things that I think Americans ought to know. These are the kinds of things that are in the it's like, do you know what this is?
Yeah, I love all of those. And, the fact that you thought about this both in terms of artifacts and documents. The other word, for something like jazz, it's not only a piece of culture or a genre of culture, it might be the most foundational American sensibility there is.
Yeah.
Right? This is, jazz is hybridity.
Yes.
Right? And so having jazz on your list allows you to kind of cover a bunch of other
and
things.
listen to some amazing music.
But to Anne-Marie's point, I want to quote a document and tell me if this sounds familiar to you. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Familiar? Yeah?
If not, you all have to go home right now.
That is from the 1972 platform of the Black Panther Party. Right? And E.D. Hirsch uses that example to make a point, which is a point to be remembered today in this age of activism, which is that radicalism dressed in the garb of traditionalism carries all the more power and force, right? That the Black Panther activists of the late 60s and 70s understood that when they were claiming America, the best way to claim America was literally to claim America, to appropriate the language, to appropriate the symbols, to claim these things. There's not a word in that preamble there that, of course, that could not be applied to the work that the Black Panthers envisioned trying to do, right? And he further quotes a passage from a Black Panther document saying, in this land of milk and honey, the almighty dollar rules supreme and is being upheld by the faithful troops who move without question in the name of law and order. That sentence right there is like a little bundle of cultural memes and references, right? Milk and honey. What does that mean? Law and order. Okay, that's a phrase, but that's also a Nixonian phrase that resonated in that time, right? The almighty dollar, right? You have these references that are packed in tight. And part of E.D. Hirsch's point was that whatever your goal, indeed, particularly if your goal is to challenge the status quo and the establishment, it behooves you to be able to take command of this language and this inheritance, right? E.D. Hirsch was attacked for being conservative, but in fact, his argument was this is actually incredibly progressive to arm and equip people who are without power and without voice, this currency, as Anne-Marie puts it, of power and voice, which is being able to speak the lingo that gets heard in halls of power, that gets understood in rooms like this, that gets understood in passing when you read a thing in the New York Times op-ed page. It doesn't have to be explained, doesn't have to be hyperlinked, because you just know it. You know that reference, right? And these are things that are often and easily taken for granted. The one thing, you can see the list that I have at the end of this article, but the one thing I wanted to draw out from my own list and then begin to open it up here for your lists and your thoughts on this. Well, you'll see, I mean, there's actually Anne-Marie named one of them at the beginning, which is whiteness. Whiteness, right? Which we're in this period right now in American life where whiteness as the invisible default, whiteness is no longer going to be the invisible default, right? And that challenges every one of us, not in a way that is about attacking whites or attacking whiteness, but is about asking how have all of us bought into a system of assigning meaning to race and color in ways that we use to either blame others or to blame ourselves or to internalize for good and bad, right? But the idea of being able, as a country, truth and reconciliation will begin to the extent this country is able to have grown-up conversations about the meaning of whiteness and how the whiteness, the meaning of the idea of whiteness was constructed in the first place, and how it has played out in our law, in our policy, in our social mores, in our culture. But the other one that I would actually draw from this list, again, back to the moment that we're in, 150 years post-Civil War, 50 years past so much of the Civil Rights Movement, is Reconstruction, right? First of all, many Americans just don't know hardly a thing about the actual period after the Civil War called Reconstruction, right? It's just a period that happened, and sometimes people have a negative valence about it, and it was carpetbaggers and Northerners taking advantage, and sometimes it was about the perspective of betrayed promises to the freedmen and so forth. But I'm not just talking about understanding the period from 1865 essentially to 1877. I'm talking about Reconstruction in sort of the same way that Anne-Marie is saying jazz. Like, that is the American project. We are now in what I would call third Reconstruction, right? The Civil Rights Movement was second Reconstruction. The Civil Rights Movement was an effort to actually make good on a document that I would put on the list, which is the 14th Amendment.
Yes.
Right? Or all the Reconstruction amendments, 13th, 14th, 15th, end slavery, equal protection, so forth. The Civil Rights Movement of 50 years ago was about actually trying to deliver on those words. That's second Reconstruction. We are now at the beginning of third Reconstruction, right? And it's not just about Baltimore and Ferguson and Staten Island and these kind of media-heavy moments. It's about everything, about how in a multiracial society where race is not only about black and white and is not figuratively a bipolar black and white matter, how are we going to reconstruct a new story of how we see each other and how we deal with each other and how we, again, find some things in common to believe in and believe are worth fighting for, right? That idea of Reconstruction is deep in the American DNA, and it's the one that I wanted to call out from my list. So we've got another 10 or 15 minutes here, and really wanted to open up for conversation and your ideas here. So yes, sir. And we have a mic, yeah, coming your way.
This feels a little frivolous to me. I got it now.
Nope.
I have a big mouth. I feel a little frivolous saying this, but I thought of it before I heard all the high-level ideas that you had. And I'm thinking of sports in the United States.
Oh, yeah.
I'm thinking of words like Serena, Brady, LeBron.
Yep.
These are references that start at the top, go to the bottom. They're truly American.
That is not only not frivolous, it should be front and center, right? I think that the popular culture is more perishable than some of the other stuff we're talking about here, but again, if you're a newcomer to the United States or to the mainstream of the United States, and you hear people talking about LeBron, it helps to know what LeBron, that LeBron is not a region of France. My mother, who was born in China and came to the United States, in her kind of after high school. Both my parents actually loved to pick up American slang, and they kind of picked it up only partially successfully, right? There was a period where my mom worked at IBM, and she worked with a team of people who were a lot younger, and they would say things like, "Hey, dude, what's going on?" Right? And my mom would just kind of listen to them and kind of join in the conversation. And one day she saw them at the cafeteria and sat down with them and gave her best impression of what she thought she heard. She said, "Hey, dots," instead of "Hey, dudes," right? And
We had a lot of that too.
yeah, and so dots has become part of the kind of family vocabulary running joke. But slang and kind of the culture of the moment is part of this too.
It's part of it. But I do have to say, so I'm the granddaughter of an All-American football player, and I live with 3 men. And my sports vocabulary is pretty good. But I have to tell you, that's kind of a male thing, right? It's not that women don't love sports, but all business was like, yeah, to make it in business, you had to master Sunday, Monday Night Football. You had to go in the next morning. You had to talk the talk. If we're really all America, that sports is a big part of it, but we have to understand sports is not as big a part of it as for all Americans as it necessarily is for all male Americans. And I don't want to say that women don't like sports and we can't follow it, but I do want to say, as I hear you say that, I think it's not the first thing.
Not while the U.S. Women's World Cup team
No,
is marching to victory,
I
right?
get it. I'm all for it, but it's part of that same. I mean, people who don't feel like that's part of it have to be able to speak out.
Yeah.
Henry Lambert from New Orleans. One document I think ought to be included, which I think a lot of people have forgotten, is the Atlantic Charter.
Yeah.
It's the reason that Roosevelt and Churchill agreed to this, that said we'll go into the war because we have this goal. I can't name them all by heart. I think freedom of religion, et cetera, to be happy and things like that. But I think people have to be reminded that that's our goal for the planet. And so I think that ought to be one of the
That's a great one.
things.
That's a great one.
It comes right after the Declaration of Independence. My question is, how does your discussion of this help us get to better race relations?
Oh, well, I mean, this in many ways is, so this is a project that my program here at Aspen is undertaking. Both the project of crowdsourcing lists and coming up with a kind of what we, in the big sense, think American culture is. But I actually think race conversations, I think, in this country are most productive when they are not just about me and about you, but about a third thing, right? It's why, for instance, I believe, those of you who are in the Aspen orbit know about the Franklin Project, the project here at the Aspen Institute that is promoting national service, right, and encouraging young people to do a year of voluntary national service. The reason why I believe in that, the reason why General Stan McChrystal, when he was here a couple years ago, got this whole project kicked off, is precisely recognizing that in an ever more diverse society where people have fewer reference and memes and kind of things in common that they can refer to, that it's not only enough to just say, hey, let's have a conversation about how you and I are different, right? But also actually to have you and me go do something together, a third thing. Go build something, go work on something, go serve something, go make something. And so the act of even creating this kind of common vocabulary project, this new American 2.0 list, is itself a third thing. It's a way to kind of draw people into the conversation that isn't just about who you are and who I am, but is about who we are.
And I mean, one of the things that'll help is figuring out what we hold in common. People will see past skin color. I mean, one of the things I think you will find if we collectively and representationally were engaged in this enterprise, I think you'd find many African Americans putting many more religious references on that list of what America should know. And we've just been through that. The massacre in a black church is not accidental. I mean, I just then watched Selma with my kids afterwards, and you listen to Martin Luther King and the Southern leadership, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and you realize that indeed, even in my own workplace, many of the African Americans in the workplace are offended by a presumed liberal atheism that many whites have, right? We just presume if you're a liberal white, you don't believe in God. And so I think there's a way there of having that conversation about what it is that we should know that will transcend skin color and more about the different parts of our culture, different communities of Americans hold tight.
The only slight variation I would put on what Anne-Marie just said is there are times when transcendence is important, and there are times when straight-on reckoning without trying to transcend, but actually embracing, back to New Orleans, embracing the hybridity.
Yeah.
Right? America is the world's greatest generator of hybrids, right? And that's our competitive advantage. That's, I don't care how, I've said in other contexts, China's GDP will surpass that of the United States at some point in the next few years, right? But our capacity to generate hybrids of culture and meme and idea and bloodline is what's going to make this nation remain indispensable. And to make real hybrids doesn't mean that you're trying to skip past your culture or your skin color or your race. It's actually saying, how can we graft part of what you are into part of what I am and make, kimchi burritos or something, right? And, and make these kinds of hybrids. Yes, sir, over here. And then we'll come to the back.
Can we expand the thinking to include an American ideal to make the world? Can we expand the thinking to include the American ideal to make the world a better place for everyone through innovation? Whether you talk medical, okay, because America has given more medical benefits to the world than anybody else, or the computer, or even talking about Walt Disney and the Disney shows and what the Americans have done in terms of a cultural benefit to the world for the kind of thinking we have in our entertainment systems. Does that also fit within the cultural change or the culture that you're thinking about for America?
You bet. I'm sorry Walter Isaacson's not here, but he would tell you the straight line from Franklin to Einstein to Jobs, is a line of a society and a culture and a cultural operating system that encourages innovation, right? That is both a part of what makes us unique if we nurture it. But it's also a thing about which we should be literate. We should be able to talk about an American tradition, from Franklin to, to the cotton gin, to what have you, and to
Putting a man on the moon.
Putting a man on the moon.
But I agree with that, but I would also stick to just making the world a better place in your sense. So the four are freedom of expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. That's good enough for me. I think innovation's a big part of doing that, but sometimes it isn't just innovation. It's just standing firm when people are being killed, being massacred.
Yeah, but culture of innovation
ways.
is on your list,
Yeah.
so I like that. I'm going to get you to think about your list. So.
As an ideal, how would you see this core cultural language be disseminated? Do you think it's family, sort of parent-child, or education down, or, excuse me, nerve-wracking. So how would you see that disseminated throughout? We're talking about getting a new language started, but where do you see it coming from, and who has the burden to do it?
Well,
All of us.
All of us. I think this is truly let's not let off the hook too quickly public schools, right? But let's also recognize the limitations of resource and politics, frankly, that make it hard for public schools sometimes to engage in these conversations in a truly open way. I think it's incumbent upon all of us as neighbors, as citizens, as parishioners, as parents, as grandparents, as people in businesses and organizations, as philanthropists, whatever it is, to be sparking basically a version of this conversation, right? And the thing at the end of the day is not going to be a canonical list, right? The thing is going to be an ever-evolving network of ideas and concepts, right? And sometimes, in some periods, some nodes in that network are going to loom really large, like Reconstruction does today, right? Because it's just historically resonant. And other times, other nodes might loom larger. And I mean this both literally and figuratively. Like part of what Anne-Marie and I are plotting together is a project literally to build out the technology of creating something like this that anybody can go experience and go both contribute to and learn from the kind of network map of concepts that are part of this American cultural vocabulary. But it's also figurative in the sense that wherever you're coming from, if you have a stronger Southern history and orientation in the nodes that matter to you than I do as a Northerner, those nodes will differ. But I think we each have to carry it.
And think about what it would do. It's like Eisenhower, plans are useless, but the planning is everything. Think about the process of doing it as a family. I was thinking about what does my family think it's important to know? That's different. But then think about doing it as a church, doing it in a school. That very process of asking yourselves raises debate that doesn't mean that the list itself is irrelevant, but that the process of getting to it is every bit as important.
Yes, sir.
Hello, I work at a large research university, and we have almost 9,000 international students on our campus. We're noticing a prejudice among the international students for African American students because their perception of African American students is from the media.
Jeez.
And they see them as being threatening. And so there's a new problem developing within academic institutions and within our country because people coming from outside of the country are getting a lot of their views of what African Americans are tending to do, and that is violence. They see a lot of violence associated with African Americans in movies and TV shows, and they're getting their perception from that. So we're having to contend with that to help them change that impression of African American students. So the prejudice is not necessarily there among the American students, it's the international students coming in.
Wow.
That's that is a real and a heartbreaking reality. And the thing that I would say, just by way of closing up our conversation here, is twofold. Number one, that point that you're making, sir, is a reminder of the incredible, often unintended force and power that American popular culture has everywhere. Here, of course, amongst ourselves, but also around the world, right? Another project that I want to just mention in passing that we're catalyzing here with my program at the Aspen Institute and partners, my friend Lucas Welch was in the room a second ago. We're doing this new project that is about reimagining American narratives. And part of what you're talking about here is a narrative that has taken hold, in particular about African Americans, but it's part and parcel of a larger set of storylines. Like you can kind of catalog a bunch of storylines that are American storylines, right? And some of them are, we're innovators, we're a can-do people. Some of them are, we're a country riven by race hate and race violence, right? There are these different storylines. And part of what I want to invite you all to do as we part today is not only to think a bit about what would be on your list and to do as Anne-Marie is modeling and to actually catalyze that conversation about your list at the dinner table, at your house of worship, wherever it may be, but actually to think about what is our part in propagating, perpetuating certain storylines in America, right? Sometimes they're good stories, sometimes they are harmful stories. Sometimes we propagate them by retelling the joke or retelling the story. Sometimes we propagate them by just not saying anything when someone else says the story, right, or says the joke. We all have a hand in shaping, by omission and commission, these stories that we all kind of absorb through popular culture, through politics, through all the things that surround us in the media sphere, and through our own norms and conversations. And that ethic of we are going to be the change, we are going to be the new storytellers, is what we hope to leave you with. And Anne-Marie, I don't know if you wanted to have a last thought.
Just one word on that. That is troubling. but sounds right to me. But you know, we pull together vis-a-vis other nations, right? That is the time. I mean, to go back to Roosevelt, to go back to, and one way that could turn is to invite the American students, not the African American students, but all the American students, to think about what messages they want to communicate. Yours is still an American university, right? They have still come to an American university, and part of coming to an American university, it seems to me, is to ask the American students what messages and what they want their fellow students to know. And it seems to me you could have a very interesting conversation about that, and you would find American students who might feel divided otherwise suddenly, and I've seen this having taught foreign law students at Harvard Law School for many years, the Americans suddenly felt much more united in trying to explain our culture to others.
Well, let that be a great watchword for us. Thank you all for this conversation, and thanks to Anne Marie Slaughter. Thank you.